The Nazgul were Sauron's most fearsome servants. They were powerful, terrifying, and completely loyal to their master, and Sauron would not have had the success he had in the Third Age without their services. So this begs the question, if the Nazgul were so effective, why didn't Sauron create more of them? For those who aren't aware, a quick history lesson on the origins of the Nazgul. They were 9 men, great warriors and kings from across Middle-earth, 3 of them being Númenóreans, who were given rings of power by Sauron in the mid-Second Age. The rings empowered them, but gradually corrupted them, extending their lifespan until their physical bodies faded, causing them to become wraiths. From that point on, they were utterly enslaved to Sauron, and were his most powerful servants. And they had quite a list of accomplishments. While Sauron was recovering his strength in the east after being defeated by the Last Alliance, the Nazgul acted as his proxies, carrying out his orders across Middle-earth. The leader of the Nazgul, the Witch King of Angmar, had great success in destroying Arnor, the Northern Kingdom, and afterwards the Nazgul recaptured Mordor and seized Minas Ithil, which became Minas Morgul, and from there they would launch frequent invasions against Gondor. Sauron only openly returned about 50 years before the War of the Ring. Before that, at least in name, everything was done by the Nazgul. So Sauron has these super effective, completely loyal servants. It seems like a no-brainer that he should want more of them. But could he create more Nazgul? And if he could, then what were his reasons for not creating more of them? What were his reasons for simply sticking with the 9? So could Sauron create more Nazgul? The answer is yes, but we'll get to that in a moment. The most obvious answer seems like it would be, why not craft more Rings of Power? However, the issue with this is that creating powerful artifacts requires one to pour some of their own finite strength into the object. In the Second Age, the creation of the Rings of Power was a collaboration between Sauron at the peak of his strength and some of the most talented elven smiths of the time. It was not an easy task. We know this because Saruman tried and failed to create his own potent Rings of Power, and like Sauron, he too was a servant of Aule. In the Third Age, Sauron is much weaker. Most of his strength is tied up in the One Ring, and he doesn't have competent help, so he probably wouldn't be able to create more Rings of Power. Okay, but could you double up the Nazgul on a Ring of Power? We don't actually know because it was never tried. The fact that Sauron never tried suggests that it might not have been possible, that a Ring of Power could only bind one person at a time. You'd think if anyone knows, it would be him. But that shouldn't be taken as fact. In the Third Age, Sauron actually took back possession of the Nine, so the Nazgul could still exist without personally holding their rings. Likewise, in the case of the One Ring, Gollum was still bound to it whilst not being in possession of it, and while he was enjoying his horribly extended lifespan, Bilbo and later Frodo were already experiencing the same life extension. The same might have been possible with one of the 9, but we just don't know. Alright, so how could Sauron have created more Nazgul if he couldn't create more rings, and if he maybe couldn't double up the Nazgul on a single ring? The answer is the Dwarven Rings. So the 9 and the 7 are functionally the same rings. They were all intended for the elves and were then given to dwarves and men as a plan B. The differences in the way that each race was affected by the rings was not due to the rings themselves, but simply due to the differences in race. Dwarves were resistant to domination, but susceptible to greed. Men are susceptible to domination and all forms of power. And don't feel bad if you didn't know this, it's a common misconception. During the Third Age, Sauron recovered 3 of the Dwarven Rings, the last being Thrain's Ring in 2845. The other 4 Dwarven Rings were consumed by dragons. So Sauron could have palmed these rings off to potential candidates, and within a century or 2, maybe longer, he could have had 1, 2, or even 3 extra Nazgul serving him. Considering how potent a single Nazgul is, having to face off against 3 more of them is a pretty big deal. So why didn't Sauron try this? Well, we actually get a bit of an answer from letter 246, written in 1963 to one Mrs. Eileen Elgar. She comments on Frodo's inability to relinquish the One Ring at Mount Doom, so it's got nothing to do with creating extra Nazgul. But Tolkien answers in depth and gives us some valuable insight as to why Sauron might have been hesitant to create more Nazgul, and the clue is in how Sauron took the 9 back into his own possession. The obvious difference between Sauron in the Second and Third Age is that in the Second Age, he possesses the One Ring. In the Third Age, he does not. The whole original purpose of the One Ring was to dominate the bearers of the other rings of power, originally intended to be elves. This is how the Nazgul became enslaved to Sauron. They possessed their rings while he possessed the One Ring. But in the Third Age, Sauron does not have the One Ring, so he takes back the Nine so that he can still control the Nazgul. Now, that's not to say that the Nazgul would have rebelled against him, but the fact that he took back their rings suggests that Sauron might have feared this. And in Letter 246, Tolkien deals with the hypothetical where Frodo was allowed to claim the One Ring without Gollum's interference. In this hypothetical, the Nazgul arrive at Mount Doom to deal with Frodo. It's kind of an amusing situation, because Sauron has the Nine in his possession, he remains the primary controller of the Nazgul. However, because Frodo possesses the One Ring and is actually trying to use it properly, the Nazgul can't actually harm him and have to obey minor commands as long as they don't interfere with Sauron's will. Basically, the Nazgul need to trick Frodo into going to Barad-dûr with them, where Sauron will deal with him, or rather hilariously, if Frodo refuses, they must wait around until Sauron comes to them. In this hypothetical, while Frodo has grown in strength, he does not have the power to master the One Ring, but even then, the Nazgul are in an awkward situation. Yes, they're still 100% loyal to Sauron, but Frodo has some level of power over them. But if Sauron does not have their rings of power in his possession, where then would their loyalties lie? Perhaps not with Frodo, but in another hypothetical where someone stronger claims the One Ring, who then would the Nazgul end up serving? So it seems like Sauron took back the Nine as a measure of insurance, that no matter what happened with the One Ring, with the exception of it being destroyed or mastered by someone like Gandalf, which would have destroyed Sauron completely, Sauron would still retain control of the Nazgul, his most powerful servants. This might also explain why Sauron did not hand out the 3 Dwarven Rings he possessed. He actually did promise to give them to King Dain of Erebor if he helped Sauron find Baggins, but that was probably a lie. Anyway, without the possession of the One Ring, Sauron would not be able to ensure that these 3 rings wouldn't be used against him in some way. Sure, the bearer of them would inevitably be corrupted, but that doesn't mean they wouldn't be able to harm Sauron. Evil often harms evil. That would explain why Sauron was so intent on recapturing the Dwarven Rings. He was afraid of them being used against him. So basically, while no longer holding the One Ring, Sauron opted for the safer path. Sure, he could potentially create new Nazgul, but that would involve putting rings of power back into the open market, so to say, which would run the risk of them being used against him, or in extreme circumstances losing control of his Nazgul should a powerful foe try to master the One Ring. It was safer to keep the 9 in his possession and to keep the 3 Dwarven Rings locked away. After all, the 9 Nazgul had been doing a fine job. There wasn't really a need for more of them, especially with the risks that it brought. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video or found it interesting. If the audio sounds different to you, it's because I'm recording this video in a completely different location. I'm talking like thousands of kilometers away. So yeah, this is a question that's been asked a few times, and to my surprise, I couldn't find someone else covering this topic. Maybe I just didn't look hard enough. That's always a possibility with me. Anyway, cheers, farewell, and remember, just because you could, doesn't mean you should.